Short Mystery and Suspense Collection 17. Cheating the Dead by Mont Hurst, Jr. From Mystery Magazines, April 15th, 1924. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. Cheating the Dead by Mont Hurst, Jr. I shall never forget the Levereux case as long as I live. The circumstances surrounding the solution of this case showed the keenest kind of thought and deduction I have ever known. My work as secretary to Howard Elliott, the famous motion picture producer, naturally drew me into the case. I had known Elliott for years. I was first associated with him when we were members of a little tabloid show playing the smaller cities of the West, and our greatest ambition in those days was to see our names on Broadway. At a small town in Southern California, the show property was attached by the sheriff. Our manager disappeared with what few funds remained, leaving the company stranded. Howard Elliott and I rode a freight train into Los Angeles. At this time, the motion picture industry was in its infancy. 2 or 3 companies had opened studios in Los Angeles, and we secured work at one of them as extras. Elliott's rise was spectacular. He worked as a leading man, scenario writer, director, and finally secured backing to launch his now great company. He became known as Howard Elliott, the Great Producer, while I had only attached success in a small way, became known as Plain Bill Monroe, production manager in Elliott's company. The great success Elliott had made was not gained without making a few enemies. In the motion picture game, quick action, rival publicity, and the bidding for stars' contracts naturally led to Elliott's making a few enemies. Of course, nothing serious had ever come out of it, until one day Elliott became involved in an argument with Alfred LaRue, one of the older producers. The climax of this bitter enmity was reached when, at a party at the Mathwick Country Club, Elliott and LaRue came to blows. The men were separated. The final crushing of Alfred LaRue as a producer came when Elliott outbid him for the contract of Olga Wendell, a famous star. Elliott also won the heart and hand of Miss Wendell, and thus a double blow was dealt LaRue, who had been madly in love with her. A month later, LaRue was a bankrupt. He had put his whole fortune into preparations starring Olga Wendell. She was a great public favorite, and her name was a box office attraction. Losing her services had wrecked LaRue financially, but losing her hand had made a madman of him. After this coup of Elliott's, LaRue retired from the motion picture colony. He went to his country estate up in the valley and was seldom seen except at social affairs at the country club. Rodney Morton's estate adjoined that of LaRue. He was in the midst of the social whirl, being a director of several banks and the silent partner of Howard Elliott. Just after Lent, Morton gave a weekend party. Most all of the movie colony was invited, I among them. Alfred LaRue was urged to come. Rodney Morton was endeavoring to act as a peacemaker between LaRue and Elliott. In the ballroom of Morton's house, it was noticed that LaRue seemed morose and very quiet. Rodney Morton came over and gave LaRue a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Come, Alfred, forget the past and bury the hatchet. There's no reason why you and Howard Elliott should be on the outs," he said. Then, turning, he called to Elliott to come over. As Elliott approached, he saw LaRue and stopped, then shrugged his shoulders and sat down beside LaRue. "How are you, Alfred P.?" he said genially. "Why should you care?" was LaRue's surly answer. "Now, you fellows be good sports and get together. The old saying, all's fair in love and war, still holds good, And it was truly a business war between you two, said Morton. LaRue got up and called Elliot to follow. They went out on the lawn, and in a few moments Elliot returned. I'm going over to Alfred's house for a while tonight, Rodney, he said, smiling. He seemingly wants to be friends with me and has a few bottles of really old stuff to sample. I'll see you fellows later, Elliot added as he prepared to leave. About 12 that night, Elliot came in and went directly to his room after calling out a cheery "good night" to us. We were up rather late that night as a poker tournament was in progress. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning before we retired. The next morning, we were awakened by the housekeeper of LaRue banging on the front door. We dressed hurriedly and rushed downstairs. We opened the door and let her in. She was greatly excited. "Oh, Mr. Morton, Johnson the chauffeur found Mr. LaRue dead down by the lake. He did not come down this morning, and we started to search for him. A bullet hole was in his head. Oh, sir, it's terrible." "Come on, fellows, and let's go over. Phone the sheriff and coroner, Hargis," said Morton as we heard the news. We hurried down to the lake. Johnson had not touched anything. The body of LaRue was lying between two small willow saplings. Johnson had looked at the body and hurriedly notified the housekeeper. Howard Elliot seemed very nervous. As we examined the ground about the body, we noticed several cigarette butts. Morton picked one up and examined it. Without a word, he passed it to me with a look of concern. I looked at the stub and saw the initials of Elliot in gilded letters on one end. I knew he bought special-made cigarettes with his initials on them. It was a known fact of all of us that LaRue never smoked cigarettes. Just then, Bill Watson, the sheriff, came up. He spoke to each of us and began to examine the body. Of course, he picked up the cigarette stubs and called to Elliot. "Well, sir, these look like your cigarettes, don't they?" Elliot said nothing, but slightly nodded his head. Watson walked down to the bank of the lake a few feet. He stopped and picked something out of the water. Then he came back to us, and in his hands held a wet silk handkerchief. The initials in the corner were HWE. I knew the handkerchief belonged to Howard Elliot. With all this evidence against Elliot, I could not bring myself to believe him guilty of the murder of LaRue. Bill Watson spoke again. "Elliot, you are under arrest for the murder of LaRue. The evidence clearly points to you. I have questioned the housekeeper of LaRue and know that you were in his house last night. Everyone knows that you and LaRue were bitter enemies. You will have to go to the district attorney's office with me, where you may be able to arrange bail." We were stunned at this serious turn of events, although the evidence was strong enough to warrant the arrest of Elliot. The men had been bitter enemies, and Elliot was known to have been at the home of LaRue. His own initialed cigarette stubs and handkerchief had been found near the body of LaRue. Things looked black indeed for Howard Elliot. Of course, we rallied to him and assured the prisoner of our support and friendship. Just as Bill Watson was preparing to take Elliot to town, Don Casper, the scenario writer, spoke up. I had noticed that he seemed to be in a deep study all during the time we were there. "Wait just a moment, Mr. Watson. I think I have this thing solved. Howard Elliot is not guilty. LaRue committed suicide," said Casper. "Well, I'll wait just long enough to hear your fairy tale," said Bill Watson with a sneer. "I believe I can prove my theory to your satisfaction," said Casper. "Do you see that sapling? Well, just look at the small piece of string dangling from the top of it." We looked at the sapling. It was only about 10 feet in height. The body of LaRue lay at the base of it. At the top of the sapling was a piece of string about 3 feet in length. "My theory is this," Caspar went on. "LaRue, seeking revenge on Elliot, and being despondent over his loss of the love of Miss Wendell, devised a plan of revenge. He succeeded in getting possession of the handkerchief and some cigarettes belonging to Elliot. Last night he invited Elliot to his home. After a few rounds of drinks, Elliot left. After he had gone, LaRue came down here to the lake with his own revolver. He smoked several of the cigarettes and scattered the stubs around under the sapling. Then he took the handkerchief and tossed it into the water where it would not float away. Next he pulled the sapling over and tied the string to the top of it. He made a loop in the other end of the string and put the butt of the gun in the loop. See the loop in the string? Then, pressing the revolver to his head, he fired. As he fell, the sapling, being bent, bounded back upright. Of course, the revolver and string fairly flew back into the air with such force that the revolver was hurled from the loop into the water. The sapling acted very much like a slingshot. LaRue probably had tested this before and knew how it would act. We can prove my theory if someone will get a bathing suit and search for the revolver in the lake on a line with the sapling." We were astounded at this theory. Morton sent Johnson for a bathing suit, and Bill Watson laughed skeptically as he said, "You won't find anything in the lake but a lot of mud and turtles." Johnson soon returned with a bathing suit, and Morton put it on. He was carried out into the lake about 40 feet from the bank in a canoe. There he began diving for it. After 20 minutes he arose and in one hand held a revolver. When he came out of the water he handed the revolver to Bill Watson. An examination showed the name of LaRue on the handle. It was the type of revolver used in the French army, and it was well known that LaRue had served under the French flag as a captain. Bill Watson was dumbfounded. The only thing he could do was release Howard Elliot. "I guess you ain't guilty, Elliot," he said as he turned to Judge Hare, the coroner, who had just arrived on the scene. After a short examination, Judge Hare's verdict was that Alfred LaRue came to his death by self-destruction. At the home of Morton we enjoyed a late breakfast. Finally Howard Elliot asked, "Caspar, how did you come to the theory of suicide?" The writer smiled. We were all waiting to hear his answer. "The first thing that came to my mind was that you were innocent, Elliot," he said. "And of course I was on the lookout for any possible clues. The first thing I noticed was the piece of loop string dangling from the top of the sapling. A week ago I was strolling along the banks of the lake and observed LaRue experimenting with the sapling. The string held a rock, and as he bent the sapling over, he would let go, and each time as it bounded up, the rock was hurled into the water." Howard Elliot spoke. "You certainly have my heartfelt thanks, Caspar, and I can't begin to thank you. Things were decidedly against me. I was beginning to think I was in for a trial for murder." "Oh, there was no danger, Elliot, because I knew you were innocent before we went to the lake. You came in at 12, and I distinctly saw LaRue leave his house at 2 this morning. I sat up all night working on a new photoplay, and as your room is next to mine, you could not have left without me hearing you." The end of Cheating the Dead by Mont Hurst, Jr.